Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy to bring the conversation I had with Christine Rosen. Christine is a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, where she focuses on American history, society and culture, technology and culture, and feminism. She's also a columnist at Commentary Magazine and one of the co-hosts of the Commentary Magazine podcast. She's a fellow at the University of Virginia's Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture and a senior editor in an advisory position at the new Atlantis. She has a PhD in history with a major in American intellectual history from Emory University and a bachelor's in history from the University of South Florida. Her writing has appeared everywhere, from the National Review, New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and many other outlets. She is the author or co-author of many books, including her most recent, The Extinction of Experience, Being Human in a Disembodied World. And that is what we talk about in the conversation. We start by talking about the value of human experience and what that means. Speed of change with technology, becoming users, not individuals, embodied experience, and spatiality. We also talk about audience capture, institutional reform, what experiences will look like in the future for humans, and many other topics. I have to say, Christine is a delight to talk to. She's very, very sharp on so many topics. She's a fantastic writer and really, really just absolutely engaging and wonderful and lovely to talk to in conversation. I was really pleased with how much philosophy is in the conversation. And it was really cool to bring up folks like Merleau-Ponty and others when talking about perception and experiences and how our relationships with others are impacted. And she was there along with me and really just talking about all these really, really wonderful topics like she does in her book, which I highly recommend. So it was a real treat, this conversation. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com, also on YouTube. So like, subscribe, share with your friends, and all of the wonderful things that everyone does already to contribute. Much appreciated. And now I bring you Christine Rosen. I am here with Christine Rosen. Christine, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'm very much looking forward to speaking with you.
Thanks so much for having me. Look forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. You have a wonderful book out. This is The Extinction of Experience, Being Human in a Disembodied World. Out through the wonderful Norton publishers. The cover's nice too. Actually, this is a painting. I
got to choose that. It's one of my favorite Winslow Homer paintings.
Yeah. It's very nice. It's nice. And great title. So we're gonna talk all about it. Before we do, just tell listeners a kind of picture of who you are, kind of what your day job is, what you do on a regular basis, any of your relevant background or professional experience that you want to share.
Sure. I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a think tank public policy research center here in Washington, D.C. I'm also a columnist and tape a podcast every day for Commentary Magazine, which is based in New York. And I'm a fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture at the University of Virginia. Those are my day jobs. My hobby is a martial arts instructor. I teach Aikido at a dojo here in DC and love teaching and training in the martial arts. And my initial training was actually, I'm trained as a historian. I have a PhD in American history, but I decided early on not to go into academic work and moved to Washington as a young grad student and kind of never left, which wasn't the original plan, but the town has oddly grown on me. So I find myself here doing all kinds of eclectic social science, public policy, history work, and really enjoy it.
Yeah, Washington, D.C. has a way of, it's very much a transplant city, but it has a way of, for some folks, it kind of gets its claws in you and then it doesn't let go for some people. Some people, they come and they run away screaming. They're like, it's too much. I don't like all the politics. I got to get out of here. So it just depends. And as most people know, and as I was telling you before we started, I live just up the road over here in Western Maryland. So Washington, D.C. is not far. I grew up around there. So very nice. And I guess, AEI and in D.C., I guess, where do you find yourself, I guess, aligning, I guess, sort of, politically of sorts? Most people know AEI as like a kind of center-right kind of think tank. And I've had plenty of people on the podcast, and I know some people that have worked there and all that. But for yourself, is it an important part of how you see things? DC kind of, you don't see things not political after. I don't either. I always see kind of things through that lens. But how do you see your kind of, I guess worldview more specifically is what I'm asking on things.
I would call myself a small c conservative in the sense that I value tradition, history. I think it's a lot easier to tear things down than it is to build things. So we should try to preserve the things that work and that we've built, and with respect for what our ancestors did before us, but with enough willingness to innovate and change the things that haven't worked. So our partisan politics now in Washington has gone a little nuts. I think both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party are in the midst of various forms of crises. Everyone's in disarray at one point or another. So it's hard. I would say politically placing myself in one of those two parties would be a challenge, although I can say that for a lot of my colleagues too. And I'm in a little program called Social Cultural Constitutional Studies, which gives me a lot of freedom to try to tackle things from a slightly different outlook than just the partisan political one. So I have lots of friends in partisan politics who on both sides of the aisle. So I get to sort of peek in on their worlds of lobbying and legislation and all the sort of horse trading that goes on. But I don't do that myself, thank goodness, because I don't think I have the temperament for it. I definitely have the historian's temperament, which is a little more slow moving, and would rather be in the dusty archives than being a super pundit on a cable news network.
Stay in the dusty archives. That's good. we need you there. You're a Burkean conservative, like the old school conservative. Yes. They don't exist anymore from what I hear, but I guess they do. There's some that's still around. I have some friends like that. Yeah, that's nice. Well, I'm a moderate liberal, but I'm very sympathetic to folks on different worldviews and stuff. So we'll our Venn diagram will slowly make its appearance somewhere in the conversations. Nice. Okay. So for your book, I guess the big question here is one way of asking it is, what led you to write this book? I know you got like a memoir, and I think you have a few other books you've written, but what made you to what's the main thing in the book? And, why do you feel there's a particular kind of erosion of experience, more so an embodied one of experience? How do you see these things? How do you see these ideas? What was the driving force for you?
Well, I've been studying technology and human behavior for more than 20 years. A group of friends and I founded a journal called The New Atlantis more than 20 years ago, and they were very generous in allowing me to pursue all of the weird interests of stuff that I would read online. This is pre-Facebook, pre-Instagram. This is early social media platform days. And in the process of doing that over many years, and I've, have lots of friends who do just good general tech criticism, people like Nick Carr and others, Sherry Turkle at MIT, who over the years have just been studying how our interactions with technologies change us. And all of this is very valuable work. I rely on it a lot myself. But I noticed a few years ago that the sort of quotidian everyday experiences were also changing in ways that over time, I started to find quite dramatic, but in our everyday lives, we rarely stopped and noticed. So basic things like handwriting, talking to people face to face, just being able to sit and wait in a line without getting fidgety and distracting ourselves, and just a general cultural impatience that I noted. The way people behaved in public space was changing. Again, these are small changes. People they might notice that someone's a little more rude on their cell phone in the elevator screaming into the phone, but they shrug and think, what a jerk, and move on. But I was noticing that more and more of us were starting not only to accept that kind of interaction, but to do it ourselves. And I include myself in this. And I wondered if that meant we were changing our everyday experiences in a way that was more transformative than we'd thought about. So that was the initial impulse. The title sounds portentous, Extinction of Experience.
No, I liked it. I love the title.
But it's borrowed from a naturalist, Robert Michael Pyle. And when he was studying younger generations' interactions with nature and the natural world. He coined that phrase to describe his concern that young people who grow up without hands-on embodied experience in the real world, out in nature, getting money, seeing different animals and plants and understanding how they thrive and survive, that if species started to go extinct, they wouldn't even care because they'd have no direct experience with it. It wouldn't matter to them. And that idea really resonated with me in terms of how we interact as human beings with each other on a day-to-day basis. Were there kinds of interactions as humans that we actually need that make for a civil society that we were allowing to wither or disappear?
That's nice. That last point there reminds me of, I had a conversation with somebody years ago in the podcast. I'm drawing a blank, but he was a ecologist, I believe. I can't recall. He wrote a great book. I'm totally blanking. But he made this statement, which just kind of stuck with me, which is humans had a very a great migration indoors. And the fact that we do not as much work, play, socialize as much in kind of the natural world as much as we did. Now, that's not to say that people, sit around a campfire all the time, but that so much of it is behind a screen or inside a house or inside an office, and that there's nothing wrong with that inherently, but that we do miss things, and we forsake a kind of tangible way of interacting with others in the natural world, which is obviously going to have impact on us, downstream. I guess this is truly in the definition of it, ways in which people that are conservative think about this, but is it, and I'm very sympathetic to this, is the change that we have or that we've had, and we'll talk about some of those things such as handwriting and other things, is that it's too fast. It's too many things too fast, right? I was trying to explain this to somebody the other day that I'm old enough that when I went to undergrad, I went to a small school. So when I went to undergrad, though, we didn't have really the internet. We barely had computers. And so, I had to learn the Dewey Decimal System. I had to go in a library and get the index card and then go find it on the shelf. And then I had to sit there and, I had to, I just had like a processor. I didn't word processor. I didn't have like the whole thing. And so writing a paper, how I wrote a paper evolved over 15 years. And in 15, 20 years, like it's so different now. Like when I think about, my daughter and people my daughter's age, 17, 18, early 20s, it's so wild. It's so different. It's so different in 25 years. And so is it the fact that on these basic things, you do miss things of holding a physical book, sitting down, reading, taking notes, and then having to write. Like now, everything is just you're clicking and you're moving and you're copy and pasting and you're doing all these things, and that does impact. So I guess the question here is it not that any of those things are wrong, but that it's too fast. We're not slowing down. We're not catching up enough to know all of the things that are kind of hitting us. Is that kind of one of the claims here?
It is. And look, humans are incredibly adaptable as a species, right? We learn, we grow, we create new tools, we figure out how to solve problems in lots of creative ways. But when it comes to embracing new ways of doing things on a daily basis and then, scaling up as a society, new technologies are always going to be disruptive. The difference now is that the amount of time we have to adapt to each new thing, and for me, this is also equally important. The intimacy of this particular generation of technologies compared to what came before are both new in this sense. I mean, we had decades and decades before most homes got a radio in their home. Same thing with television. Same thing with landlines. And even there was a slower pace with the acceptance of home computing. Right? You had the desktops, but they were expensive. And years passed, and then eventually everybody had a computer. The pace of change continues to shrink, so that now you go from the brick mobile phone to the flip phone to now the smartphone, which is basically a computer in everyone's pocket that can be loaded with sensors and all kinds of new, very sophisticated technologies. So our ability to think through new norms, through new behavior, and through both the positive and negative implications of these tools for our daily lives has shrunk. We just have less time to think through that. At the same time, we live in a culture here in the United States, which is incredibly techno-optimistic, right? Technology, the new thing is always going to be better. This is the assumption. And it's difficult to challenge that assumption without being told you're inciting a moral panic. I don't know how many times people have said to me, you would have hated comic books. You're just one of those scolds. And, I sort of shrug and say, well, maybe I would have, but today the comic book reads you while you read it. It's a very different sort of sophisticated technology. And a lot of the data that is gathered about our intimate lives and our daily practices and behaviors, we have no idea where it ends up or what's going to be done with that. So the pace of change is much more dramatic. But just as important, these things are now in our private spaces all the time. For many people, the first thing they pick up and touch in the morning and the last thing they touch at night isn't their spouse, it's their phone. And that is a huge shift in terms of the intimacy of our relationship with these technologies. And if you look at what patents are being applied for by all the technology companies, they want to make these things even more intimate. They want to have sensors implanted or on our skin. They want constant readability of our emotions and our daily activities, all again with the promise of greater efficiency and greater self-knowledge. But what I would say is that, human evolution has given us a great many skills, but we also there are going to be bumps in the road when it comes to adopting new ways of doing things. And our evolutionary human nature, I do believe there is such a thing as human nature. Human nature is not yet caught up to some of these tools. So we have to be cautious and ask the right questions before we allow them into our most intimate practices and daily lives in the way that I think we have uncritically done in the last few years.
Yeah, I fully agree with all that. And I think even when I was, much younger, in the late 80s, early 90s, and all the rest, there were still three major ways you got information, which was TV, radio, and newspaper. And that's fine. And I think technology and everything is super cool, and we need to know how things go in the 21st century. But I am deeply disturbed by doing things without developing norms. Now, obviously, there's the other side of this, which is, you don't want to wait too long and have to have everything perfect before you do something. But obviously, I think most people would know that we're going too fast. So now the fact that in the past, I'd say 15 years, we get information from all sorts of places. And this is eroding our trust in experts, which we do need, and eroding our trust in institutions, eroding our trust in public officials, eroding our trust. And again, not to say that those things or any of those people are infallible, but so much that the actual position of it is completely questioned. When it's weird to teach people. The number one thing you have to teach young people now is how to synthesize information, not just gaining information. That's a whole other skill set. Nobody knows how to really do that because you weren't doing that for so long. And so it's very strange how, again, there's nothing wrong with all of those things, but 15 years is a blink in the grand scheme of things. Life in 1965 was not that much different from 1995.
Right.
Of course, some things, of course, but in terms of change. And, it is strange also in terms of, you sort of kind of highlight this in the book, and Jean Twenge has talked about this, sourcing generations and stuff. But, Gen Zs and the next generation Alpha are going to be so much different in some ways because of how everything is so much quicker. Like Gen X and old millennials, basically the same. They're, and both groups would hate me saying that, but they're very similar. There's a lot
How dare you, she said, as a member of Gen X.
Right, I'm an old millennial, right? So yeah, but there's a lot of
more
overlap
similarity
there.
than difference.
Yeah, there's a lot of overlap. And I just think you're going to see that within the subsequent generation to generation, as things go faster and faster, you're going to see that much bigger. And that's odd that someone that's 5 years or 10 years older than you is going to have a big jump in certain ways. So there is some, I think, alarm here about this.
Well, this is we spend part of the challenge here. What you're talking about is sort of world formation, right? Habits of mind. How do people create a world for themselves? What do they assume the rules are? How do they learn what those rules are? What happens when they break them? And what are the expectations and norms for their behavior? And the stark difference is that older generations, although not all, but older generations didn't have those formative years, particularly adolescence and young adulthood, where they spent 8 hours on a screen, looking at a screen, mediating all of their work, leisure, pleasure, personal relationships through a screen, and also not having the expectation of instant feedback and instant communication and instant responsiveness to all their demands. So that created different habits of mind. The habits of mind, I have two 18-year-olds, so I watch the expectations they have, both of how much they can control their own world and how much control they have of the world around them, and it is completely different from what all the generations that came before, because they've been given these tools that have trained them in habits of mind to believe they have a certain amount of control. And not all of that is bad, of course. But what it does mean is that when they confront in the immovable, stubborn reality of the real world, and it doesn't conform to what the devices they have been raised on expect them to be able to do, frustration ensues, anger, anxiety, all these things that we hear younger people in particular are struggling with these days. Is it caused by the technology? No, not entirely. But the fact that so much of their lives is mediated through it creates new expectations and habits of mind that have long downstream effects that we'll be seeing for decades.
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. I don't think it's entirely the technology's fault. I think it's, this goes to your point about how, we become users and not individuals, which I think is a nice way of saying that. And it does, you start to have a certain kind of immediacy, a certain kind of expectation, which I think downstream, there is a way of having delayed gratification or having patience or having more, self-control or things like that. And that is, again, you don't want to live completely as, too discrete from how the world is, that people should just revert back to flip phones or they shouldn't have one at all. Or I don't think that's quite it, but it is a bit of, it's a new skill. It's a new form of restraint in different ways. I have a daughter that will be 18 this year. And so it's there's a certain, I try not to be the old person now. And it's like, because I heard my parents and my grandparents, our day we used to, so I try not to do that. But it is a thing of trying to say, how do you as the person decide and make the decision? This could make the decision for you if you want, but you have to kind of flip it. Things will be easier, they'll be more convenient, they'll be more accessible, but that doesn't mean it's always good. And you have to kind of make the sort of internal structure or heuristics that you want for yourselves when you're interacting with these. But that's just that's a very difficult thing when many of these things are very fast and very instant. And but I totally agree with you on how it will impact our habits of mind. Maybe you can say other things about how we see people as users and not so much as individuals, whether that's what streaming service you have or what social media or how many Amazon purchases you make or whatever it is. It is sort of it's a strange, you're a digital consumer. Like obviously in the United States, we rely heavily on this type of capitalism where it's very consumer based. Okay, that's always been the case. But I think the digital consumer, that piece of it, adds another, it puts this sort of top spin on something that's already potentially can be detrimental. What do you think about this? How do you see this?
Well, I think the promise of a lot of these platforms and technology. I mean, we saw this certainly with early internet and search. We saw it with early social media and current social media sites. The promise is, and this is something technology theorists have been arguing about and talking about for a century, is that our technologies are extensions of man, as some of them describe it. They're extensions of the best of being human, right? They help us be better at what we want to be. That's the ideal. In reality, what started to happen, because these platforms are designed to manipulate what is known about human behavior and known about human nature, you're carrying a little slot machine in your pocket in terms of the design of almost every app on your phone and what the designers and who architected that platform know about human behavior. Now, you might be an outlier in one way or the other, but basically, they know some truths about human beings, and they have designed a platform to exploit your attention and to get you coming back for more. We know all this. What I notice that's different about a lot of our use of these technologies in very mundane aspects of our lives is that we have started to expect to have to conform to the demands of the technology rather than the technology actually helping us be better humans. And by that, I mean, we rarely stop, as you said earlier, very important question to ask younger people. What are the opportunity costs of doing this analog versus digital? Seeing your friend in person, because you got to get dressed, you got to leave the house, you got to get on the bus, you got to go see them. There are logistical things that have to be done that might not be pleasant, but that get you to this goal of being face to face, which is a valuable experience. What's the opportunity cost if you just, have a quick FaceTime chat? Do you lose anything? Now, I would argue you do lose some important things by doing it that way. Is it better than nothing? Of course it is. I can talk to friends who are on the other side of the world through FaceTime, whom I otherwise used to just have to have emails, correspondence, and before that, letter correspondence. So I love seeing their faces. We loved hearing people's voices across the telephone lines. But now, the difference is that the easiest thing to do is to mediate everything because it's right there, and we have the expectation for convenience and ease is so high in our daily lives. So now we have to actively choose the more difficult human path sometimes, whether that's how you're going to spend time with your loved ones and friends, whether that's how you're going to interact with your colleagues at work. It's how we're going to teach our children in the classroom. Now we have to actively choose the human thing, the unmediated thing. And that, again, that's a new expectation. The technology makes so many things ubiquitous and easy. What it also does, though, and to the point about turning us all into users, we're our data when it comes to the designers of these platforms. We're not unique individuals. We're our data. Now, they want to micro-target us with ads and other things, to get us to buy stuff. But at the end of the day, there are certain kinds of human relationships that shouldn't be user-type relationships, right? Like if, a therapist and a patient, two people who are in love. You don't want both of them to think of themselves as users, but these platforms where people now find therapy, find love, find employment, find connection, they kind of flatten all of those distinctions out for the purpose of, obviously, for the platforms to make money and, to basically monetize your attention. So again, we have to think through our daily lives. In some cases, we're going to choose the mediated form because that actually just works better for whatever our goal is. But in a lot of these other places in our lives, particularly our private lives, I think we have to be very cautious about what we're giving up by mediating those interactions.
Yeah, fully agree. I'm thinking of something here. There's a couple layers deep here, I guess. So this idea of that you mentioned in the book, which I've talked to many philosophers and thought a lot about, is this idea of being there. It reminds me of the Heidegger concept of Dasein, the idea of being there, the idea of experience. When you're with somebody, right, in a certain context, I think it forces you. It's hard to really explain this because you can start arguing about definitions. I'll say it this way: when you're doing something digitally, right, and you are kind of the user, not the individual, and you're not with the person in real time, you're getting the sanitized version of something, you're not getting, for lack of a better word, right? You're not getting the real version. And what I mean by that is when you have the real version, or you have the in vivo version, I guess, you're having to deal with conflict, you're having to deal with disappointment, you're having to deal with things that are not completely perfect, you're not, and that pushes a person to make a decision at the very least about how they want to have that relationship. Whether that's, seen through the medium of, facial expressions or body posture or nonverbals or, all these other things. And I just feel like when it's overwhelmingly digital, many times what happens, I think, is it can drift towards a delusion where you can be satisfied with the idea of something and not the reality of something. And sometimes those are different, right? So like you're saying, like if you have some type of, clinical interaction, whether that's with a psychologist, therapist, psychiatrist, whatever, there's a lot that's missed. If you are trying to have a relationship with somebody and you're never seeing them in reality, there's a lot that's missed. And I think sometimes people, consciously or unconsciously, you can hide behind the idea of something and not the reality. And the reality sometimes is hard. You have to deal with somebody in a bad mood, or somebody that said something weird, or somebody, and you can't sanitize it. But that's a human experience. And it's all of the things. It's the quote unquote positive and negative. And so I sometimes wonder, on one level, and there's another thing I can bring up here on this, but the embodied component of it, or being in the same room, or being there with other people, for you, kind of on this line, this idea of something and the reality of something, what do you think here about this, about, I guess, what gets missed, or why it could not be as helpful or useful, for people in mass, especially I guess downstream?
I think we've privileged the quantity of our connections and not fostered the quality of our connections. And I think, again, human beings only have so much capacity for connection. As much as I like to think that every single person on the internet is someone I can deeply care about and connect to, that's just simply not how we're wired. We are meant to kind of have a core group of intimates, family, extended, our little villages are all these, we can create them now. We have a lot of more freedom with that. But we can easily become distracted by the quantity of information, the quantity of people we might be able to connect to, the number of followers. A word, by the way, that we should note and attend to. They're not our friends, they're our followers. And that is a very distinct kind of relationship, it's not a relationship of equals necessarily. And you can follow a brand just like you can follow a human being. But when it comes to those in-person interactions in particular, we know from a lot of interesting communication and technology research, it's much easier to do certain things when you have a mediating screen. You can lie. You can get away with lying easier. You can dissemble. You can mislead. It's all a lot easier on a screen. We're not exactly sure why. Some of it's the sort of, not just the physical facial cues, even if you can see someone's face. It's bodily cues. It's posture. There's just something that, again, the things we know without knowing why we know them. When you bump into someone and you just get a bad vibe, as the kids say, you're like, I didn't like that person. That is actually your physical body giving you a sign of something. And then you learn as a human being, as you mature, to read those signs, to listen to them. One of the things our technologies do, and I see this a lot in younger people, is kind of try to persuade us that we don't need to listen to our own signals, not trust our own intuitions, if you will. And that's a combination of having these technologies that will do it for us, and also a world that says, oh, you shouldn't trust your gut, you got to trust the experts. And in many cases, you should trust the experts. But there are some things that as human beings, we can know and understand if we attend to them, if we pay attention. And one of the things that concerns me about the way that public space in particular, and civility, a word that we don't even bother to use anymore because it's disappearing so rapidly, those things are basically everyone agreeing in public space, even though we're strangers, we're all going to kind of have each other's back. We're going to be aware of each other. We're going to try to be respectful so that if something happens, someone's in peril, someone's in distress, we'll attend to that because you know what? We're all human beings and that's what we do. We've lost that. Now, in big cities, there's always been an argument about, whether strangers would help and everything. But we've all become bystanders in our own lives in so many ways because we can remove ourselves mentally and emotionally from physical space whenever we feel like it. So what that means for those relationships, like you were saying, when you're in person, you have less control over not only how the interaction begins and ends, but will it be positive? Will it be negative? When you're on a screen, you can always hit a button and disappear. And you don't have that option in real space. And so it is it causes anxiety, sure. It causes, concern. It also is what allows for genuine, true connection and happiness. So the fear of not having that control, I think, drives people to the screen because it's easier, it's seamless, it's convenient, it's on their time and on demand. But they miss the good stuff too in doing that and choosing the convenience over the kind of rewarding struggle of really being in each other's presence as much as possible.
Yeah. I again agreed. I think what you were mentioning is the sort of the kind of the infamous the Dunbar number, right? I think the Dunbar number is 150 people is like the max of sorts, plus or minus, that you could really attend to over your life or whatever it is. It's interesting research. I think the thing that you're explaining, I mean, this is where, I go to the phenomenologist, Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger and stuff, is this idea of, just for listeners, usually we have, we have the objective experience, right? So it's, the objective piece of it is, I'm sitting in a room, there's four walls, a ceiling, a floor, I'm sitting in a chair, there's a window, there's a light, I can objectively describe the room I'm sitting in. I can explain the subjective experience, right? Which would be, my back's a little sore. I'm feeling, my head hurts a little bit because of the light, but I'm mostly feeling in a good mood. I'm happy to talk to Christine, et cetera. I'm going to see what I'm going to eat for lunch later, whatever, right? Okay. I have a feeling, I have some affect about what's going on. But what's missing is what people would describe as the phenomenology of it, right? Which is that thing that you can't describe of sorts in those ways, but is the entire experience. It's the sort of gestalt of everything, which is, yes, you have the objective, subjective, but the idea of the thing itself, the experience of sitting in a room having a conversation, that whole experience together in tandem has a color, a texture, that has contours, which obviously would have to make it discriminate from having another conversation in another room with someone else or a group of people. That would have another phenomenology. So the thing in of itself of this experience, the total experience, is what is always missing. And I think that ether, if you will, not to sound too hokey, but that whole thing, it's not that it has more or less value per se. You can put whatever value you want on anything, objective, subjective, whatever. But it is a missing piece. And so I think to your point about control, you have less control in person, but at the same time, the other way of looking at it is you have more freedom. And people don't see it that way sometimes. They just see it as less control. So right, when you're on a screen and somebody says blah, 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 you just click it off, you put it down. I don't have to do it. It doesn't exist. But you can't do that in reality of sorts. And so I think what's missing is kind of the phenomenology, which I think is, and this is definitely what Heidegger believes, is that is, he said that Dasein was always possessive, meaning it's always mine and no one else's. That's our human experience. Animals and nature and all these things might have a type of experience, but the experience of being there with other people, that is always your own, and that's always there for you. And you can't, there are no surrogates for that. And I think that's what makes all of the technology is great. Maybe we'll get the humanoid, kind of robots and the Westworld thing, and we'll get there. Maybe we'll get there. But nothing will ever replace being in a room with someone having a conversation. It's irreplaceable.
This I think, this was a difficult thing to describe for people before the pandemic hit. Once for a lot of people, everything moved to Zoom. Did for me. I was one of the, for those of us lucky enough to be able to do our jobs behind a screen versus actually still having to go out into the world and risk exposure to a deadly virus. Mm-hmm. The way our memories form of interactions are also implicated here. So I remember a day where I did work, I did some meetings, I talked to some friends and family members. I went to a bar mitzvah, all online, all sitting in the exact same place, all on the screen via Zoom or these other platforms. And my memories of those days are much hazier, even though I have in my calendar, there it shows me. Because I didn't have a beginning and an end physically to each thing. There weren't these very clearly defined physical boundaries between, say, I would have gone to the synagogue and seen my friend's son have his bar mitzvah, rather than just sit on the screen in the same place. I would have gone to a restaurant and seen my friends. I would have maybe talked to a family member on the phone. Each of these would have been discrete memories because they were also tied to physical realities in physical place. They were tied to place. They weren't in space. And so there's something about the way our brains not only experience embodied interactions versus disembodied ones, but the way that we form memories of those experiences. And memory is very important. It's very important. This is, I think, why for children in particular, as they learn habits and they learn how to interact, they're forming a kind of social memory of experiences that might have worked well for them with another kid and others that went badly. And they learn those lessons. But it takes practice. We have to practice these skills to understand what it means when another human being, like I could be going like this at you. I'm frowning and crossing my arms. And if you know me and we have looked at each other long enough, you'd be like, oh, she's really thinking, something's got her puzzled. If you didn't, you might be, she looks really pissed. Mm-hmm. But so the assumption you make in either way has serious implications for how our interaction will go. So again, those sorts of lessons, those embodied lessons, mm-hmm. when the phenomenologists talk about experience, that's part of what they're talking about, how we learn how to be, just mm-hmm. to be human beings. Mm-hmm. It's really important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, absolutely. I have maybe I've mentioned this at different points on other episodes, but I have a sort of an unpublished essay. I kind of wrote it. I wrote different versions of it, and I was never quite happy with it. But
perfect is the enemy of the good.
It's so true. The reason I do a podcast and I don't do writing is because I am sort of a perfectionist with writing. It has to be. If it's going to be out there forever, I just need it to be good enough. But yeah. But I thought a lot about this. I thought a lot about this during the pandemic, and yeah, it's the phenomenology of space. It's the temporal piece of it in place, and I think I saw the saliency of the experience of space, being in space and in a physical place, as really important. Yes, start and end point, but also people. There's nothing magical that happens in a space. There's nothing there, right? Like, but there is in our mind, because we're embodied, right? And Merleau-Ponty absolutely correctly emphasized the use of body. Many people minimize it, but it's essential. Otherwise, you're not you without a body, right? It's not the whole thing, of course, but we definitely shouldn't minimize it. But doing a workout, doing work, socializing, big life event, a bar mitzvah, graduation, whatever, that's not all supposed to be in the same chair on a screen, right? Because you're not having appropriate transitions, and you're not having, so then things blur, and then you're having this sort of mash of experiences that don't have there's no distinctive properties anymore. the reason we go to a gym, the reason we go to an office, the reason we go to a, synagogue, temple, church, whatever, the reason we go to a bar or, a restaurant is because there's nothing special about those places necessarily, but it's a designed space to do a thing where people agree to doing that. And the transition points to and from help our experience of it to make it distinct enough, to make it purposeful enough. And that's not to say that you can't have those things, but everyone agrees it's not the same. People that graduated online, that's not the same. That's not the same as walking across the stage and having your grandparents there and everyone, I mean, even people try to discredit, LeBron James, it's like, he won that fourth one in the bubble. Not quite the same, they downgraded a little bit, So we all have, because you're not having the experience in a place, in space. And, there's nothing special about a particular space, but what makes it valuable is people in there placing the value in it. I've given this example at different points, but, if you come home and you realize that some of your stuff is kind of rearranged, some of your drawers are open and some pictures are kind of upside down, and you figure it out and you realize, well, nobody came in here. I know nobody came in here. And if you start to put it all together, you realize, well, someone came in my house. And you say, well, okay. And let's say you look at everything and all your computers and jewelry and your cash that was on the table, nothing was taken. You would feel violated. And this is basically the premise of the movie Following, one of Nolan's first movies. But there's a line in that movie, actually, it's great. He says something like, you show them what they have and then you take it away, right? And you don't really take something. You just show them what they had and then you just say what they don't have. But what do you actually have? What you have, I think, is you. You in a space over time is an extension of you. That's the phenomenology of it. Again, that's not trying to sound, Deepak Chopra, real hokey. It's the idea of you have memories in that space. If you as a possessive being are then having an extension there's a part of you in there. That's what makes that special. That's what has the memory. That's what has the experiences. That's why, people get, forlorn and they get sentimental when they leave the house they grew up in. It's just a house. There's just four walls, a ceiling, and a floor. And some windows and a door, but it's not just that. There was life that was in there. There was an extension of you. That's why when I leave my house and I go somewhere, and then I say the idea of home is because that's me in it, even when I'm not there. And so I think these types of things are instructive. This is very much an embodied thing. So during the pandemic, we didn't have any of those things. It was all just kind of some horrible lab experiment where we just combined all of these things together. And it was just a kind of, amorphous kind of thing. And it's that piece of it is completely disarming and dysregulating and totally not good for us as a human to have that experience.
Well, and I think it's why over the course of a lifetime, this matters too, because, and this is where I'll sound like an old school conservative, the limits of our physical bodies teach us humility. They teach us that we can't control everything. When we get sick or we break a bone or something goes wrong for us physically, it is a reminder of our human limitations. The technologists who want to guide us, and there is a reason that you see in Silicon Valley in particular, all these efforts to cheat death and extend life, and I'll live forever, and I'm going to come up with all these ways never to have to die. I will upload my consciousness. We laugh, but actually that is a philosophy. That is an ideology. It's a way of looking at what it means to be human that I find deeply unsettling and alienating because it recognizes no limits. So once you recognize limits, you have to live with some humility. You have to live with and cultivate empathy because you're not the only one whose body will break down. So will your loved ones, so will your friends, and they will need help. That's where the interconnectedness and obligations to each other come in. And a lot of our technologists are designing or trying to design worlds where we can pretend that's not true. So if you look at what, take Meta with its VR platforms and other places, Mark Andreessen and others, these investors and theorists who say, well, you know what, if your regular life is terrible, you should live in a virtual world where you can have all this control and do all these things, and you can have your whole life there and you'll be so much happier because you're having a real emotional interaction on the screen. And then you don't have to worry about how bad everything is for you in the real world. That, for them, they think that's an improvement. And I would argue that's actually a dystopian nightmare that we should do everything to resist. And I say that, I sound hyperbolic, but I mean every word, because accepting our limitations and understanding our limitations doesn't mean we can't innovate and try to live longer, healthier, happier, more flourishing lives. But it recognizes something unique about what it means to be human, which is that time is the one resource that we cannot replenish. And we have living with that sense of time, which all of our technologies are constantly trying to distract us from recognizing. Living with that sense of time actually does allow us to understand what's important, the relationships we should be cultivating, how much time we should spend at work versus with our families, the important questions. So those distractions become, in a way, a little more existential than just, oh, is it a bad habit that I'm playing Candy Crush all the time instead of reading a book?
I mean, you don't have to say anything if you don't want to, but this is, I'll pick on it because, I don't mind doing it. But, this is the one thing I never understood, about when I was religious and about most of the major religions. It's like, yeah, you'll live forever. It's like, that sounds horrible. That sounds depressing.
What will I do with the time?
I don't want to live for 10,000 years. I don't want to live for 100,000 years. That sounds awful. That sounds terrible. Eventually, I want to get off the ride. Like, I don't, no. I mean, I don't want to live 80 years. It'd be nice to live a little bit longer. That'd be cool. But no, the promise of that sounds awful. It sounds terrible. Whether it's eternally burning in flames or whether it's living eternally in bliss, it's like eventually I would want it to stop. Like there is that piece of it. But yes, I do think that having the limits, right, or having these things is we need to have those things. Those things are tremendously important. Tell me, I'm curious what you think about this. We've talked a lot about like the internet and social media and all that stuff. Can you give me an answer or an explanation of what has happened to so many smart people, innovative people, powerful people, that they get sucked into the audience capture, they get sucked into all these things, and they just become fucking nuts, and they become trolls, and they become, conspiracy theorists. And it's like, look, I've avoided that. I mean, I'm not really too much on social media anymore. You've avoided that, and other people have avoided that, but why are so many people that are, again, smart, powerful, innovative, it's like the worst. It's like all the way down. It's just, I don't understand. And I've seen it with very smart people people that are smarter than me in theory, in terms of like, they have more degrees or they have all of these things. And it's just like, when did your brain break? What the hell? Like that's, and I don't, I've had some ideas and I've heard some people say something, but I can't quite make sense of it. It doesn't have rhyme or reason to me. But I know you've seen this as well. I mean, we could talk about Elon Musk. We could talk about, whomever you want. But it happens too often. What do you make of this?
I think it's two things. One, as we know, and has been written about and discussed ad nauseum, the platforms are actually designed to make you keep coming back. Right. It's intermittent reward system. It hits that very base part of the human brain that's like, if I just keep coming back, suddenly I'll win. It's a slot machine. Mm-hmm. We know all this. We've known this for a long time. Some of us resist it, some of us don't. But there's another component that I think has really played out culturally and politically in the last 5 to 10 years. And that's that you're actually rewarded for the moral grandstanding you do for whatever cause you choose to promote, to be the most extreme on that, and to insist not just that you be heard, which was the promise of all these platforms, right? Everyone can have a say. It'll be great. Free speech will flourish. So good for democracy. She laughed sarcastically, bitterly, really, at this point. What it does do is it rewards the most extremes because you want everybody to endorse what you say. So it's not good enough to say, your policy proposal doesn't make sense to me. I disagree with it for these 3 reasons. What you have to say is, your policy is evil. It's actually evil. You're an evil person. It is a value and moral judgment. So these platforms reward the kind of moral judgments about things that are not moral questions. Some of the things we decide politically are moral questions, but so many things are just not. They're logistical, they're technical, they're political in the old school sense of like horse trading and like we got to compromise. But the language that these platforms reward, encourage, and exacerbate is moral language. It's grandstanding. It's promoting good versus evil. It doesn't allow for nuance. So in that sense, I think that's where really intelligent people who have strongly held, often informed views of things, they find themselves going into this spiral where they can't just state their view and have people agree or disagree. You're on their team or you're not. And if you're not, you're the enemy. And you see it. I mean, this is the joke, right? By the 3rd comment, someone's called someone else Hitler. And it's real because, there's a moral frame that kicks in very quickly on these platforms that, again, you wouldn't point at someone, I hope, and call them Hitler after a 5-minute conversation about any political subject if you were in person, standing in line at the coffee shop. But so much of what we do has been transferred to platforms that reward that sort of extreme behavior that even intelligent people can find themselves doubling down over and over again and getting caught in that sort of language of politics and cultural discussion that's just, it's a dead end, really, as we've seen for the last few years.
I agree with that. I think, let me make this kind of global of sorts. I mean, you and I both live in the same area. We live in the same country, but I don't live in other places, so I can't say, and I'm not saying that, I'm not trying to make a generalized statement here, but do you think some of that in the West, quote unquote, especially in the United States, I don't know if these things are happening as much as they are here in the U.S. or maybe in the U.K. or Canada or places like that, where people, I don't want to say they have more culture. That's not the right way to say it, but they have other things that occupy their time that they're doing in the real world or out in the world, outside doing all these things. I don't know. What do you do? Again, I'm not trying to say that these things are just a Western phenomenon or that it's just, because we have we don't have a long history, or I'm not trying to make those claims, but, do they have these issues, in Portugal when people are, they're trying to, catch, seafood to sell and to have, and they have a small town and it's nice and they have good sun and whatever. I don't know. Like, is that happening over there? I mean, I'm not too sure. It wasn't that way when I was there. It was very nice. Not everyone was linked into their phones and say, "Did you see the last thing so and so said?" It wasn't any of that. But I don't know. I mean, what do you think about this kind of on a global scale of things?
Well, I think in the developed world, the decline of trust in institutions is something that we see happening in many, many countries. And there are different reasons. But with the exception of some continually high trust societies like Japan, in Western Europe, for example, the decline in faith in the government to do things that we've seen and discussed here in the US are happening elsewhere. I think the places where you see people happier and not politicizing everything about their daily lives and every decision they make are the ones that have lower use of social media platforms. So you do see, in our daily lives, everything very quickly becomes politicized because if you take a neighborhood story, it can be global in seconds. And if it's about a hot button issue, like so-and-so showed up to the school board to argue for or against this textbook, suddenly that is world news. That is a very new thing. We are not really equipped to scale up in that way. And that allows all kinds of people who have absolutely no barrier to entry and no skin in the game to start weighing in and calling, one person good and one person bad about this textbook discussion. So in places where people resist that and where more politics is local, I think, yes. And we can do that here in the US too. We can go back to that model if we choose. Yeah. I think the challenge and what you see with the rise of populist movements, for example, and sort of strongman movements all across the developed world now, is that when people's faith in institutions decline and government seems incompetent and every single issue can be debated and go global and become very Manichaean in terms of its moral valence online, people do start to say, well, we just need someone to be in charge. We just want someone in charge to make decisions. And they will compromise certain democratic principles to find that person who will say, okay, I'm going to do this, this, and this. And if we violate the law, sue me. I mean, you see versions of this or this tone in many different countries right now. So I don't think it's just the US. We have it worse because we are techno enthusiasts about embracing these new things and assuming their positive effects and positive values before we actually think through the unintended consequences of them. And here's an old school example. I still remember when every Senate and House office in Congress got an email address. And this was supposed to be this amazing democratic thing. Suddenly you could write your congressman, you could write your senator, and you could direct democracy. It's wonderful, air your complaints. And of course, it ended up making it harder to reach your senator or your congressman because they were so inundated with spam and flooded with comments that they don't even check those accounts. You're better off sending a passenger pigeon to them to land a letter on some legislative correspondence desk. But so again, our ideals are wonderful, but we have to start being far more skeptical about the value of some of these platforms, particularly with regard to our politics, because we now see how toxic and counterproductive they can be for some of these sorts of difficult long-term, policy planning and debate.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've gone on and on and on and on about, on the podcast and with people in my life is we have to reform institutions, not tear them down. Yes. This is
where our Venn diagram is where
this is where it's vibrating right now. It's like, yes, right.
Conservative, right. Preserve the institution.
Right. Yeah, because, I've heard it on the left and the right and all these things. And it's just, my question always is, okay, so what do you do after you burn it down?
Yeah. What replaces it?
You have to do something. And it's just these things of again, oh, we don't need the Electoral College. And okay, look, there are some places you could definitely reform the Electoral College or something like that. Or, we could use a German system, mix, party proportionality or some version of that or whatever, right? But having a straight popular vote, oh God, no. Oh my gosh. Oh my goodness.
This was something the founders deeply feared for a reason. Yeah.
So it's well, we lost, and so the Electoral College sucks, so let's get rid of it. It's no, I do not want to get rid of that unless there is something in place, because then that's, that point of no return. And it's a lot of things like that. And it's just we're going to take out the Department of Education because of blah, blah, blah. It's listen, I get it. There's so many things with our education system that should be fixed and reformed and all that. But totally getting rid of that and having nothing in place, literally, where's your kid going to go to school next year? Mm-hmm. You know what I mean? I'm fine if eventually you want to do that or phase it out or whatever. But for me, I think for most things, especially, I agree. Everything is dynamic. Nothing's really static. So you have to reform institutions, but you cannot do everything by podcast and Patreon and Substack, and you can't do everything that way. You have to have institutions. You have to do things these ways. I said this to somebody. I said, how are you supposed to have 350 million people, third most populous country in the world, superpower economically, militarily, et cetera, and you got 58 places doing it 58 different ways? That doesn't work. It can't work. Like we're not a small country, we're not a city state like Monaco or something. Like, all right, like, it's fine,
But we could just burn money.
like that's different. Like I don't understand. Like you need to have something, an institution, and there needs to be a push-pull, and okay. But I get people get frustrated, but it feels like it's always the same. It's always I hear that. I do hear that, but yes, I'm even more so in the past 10 years, have been more of, we need to reform some of these institutions, because I think a lot of those, if you don't have any of those, this is maybe a bold statement, but I just think that makes you quasi un-American. Because, and that's on both sides, because it's like, I'm all for change. I'm all for doing it. We shouldn't do everything the same way it was done in 1787. I get that. But there are some critical pieces where you should preserve the institution of what made the country how it is.
It's such a presentist way of looking at things, isn't it?
Yes.
We'll just burn it all down and whatever we'll do will be better. Again, this is we're still a relatively young country. We're about to have our 250th anniversary. What I think we forget is that we should go back and look at the way that we've wrestled with some of these ethical and political questions before. Now, we were doing it under different circumstances, and certainly with not everyone who should have been allowed to participate. If you were not a white landowning male, in some cases, you weren't participating at all. If you were enslaved, if you were a woman, again. But what I think our history shows is that push-pull that you're describing, whether it's about people who didn't have a voice and wanted one, or whether it's about what state and local communities demand in terms of power versus what the federal government should be allowed to do. Our history is this glorious, messy, wonderful story of how we figured that out. Now, we did fight a civil war, and we did have to begin out of a revolution. But with the exception of those two events, we've had other minor cataclysms in terms of, disorder and violence. But that is a really unique trajectory. And that history is something we should constantly be going back to, not to get lessons about this or that, or who was terrible and oppressed and who wasn't, but to maybe give us a little sense that we're not living in an apocalyptic end time where everything should be blown up, or the way the cataclysm that our politics has become is a lot of it's rhetoric, because at the end of the day, we do know how to get along and we do know how to solve problems. But I think part of what's so pernicious about the way we talk to each other now, and this is where social media platforms in particular and the internet in general is heavily implicated, is that we take, a completely hyperbolic statement online that maybe even a public official makes, and we think it's representative of what the average person thinks or believes. Most people aren't that insane. Most people are a bundle of wonderful contradictions and might, if they could, would split their ticket on almost every vote, left or right. We're complicated, contradictory creatures, and our politics right now, because it's refracted through these platforms that reward extremes, don't reflect that. And so we have to figure out a way, and this does require political leadership. It requires politicians who, unlike, say Trump or Matt Gaetz on the right, or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez on the left, they're cultivating internet followers. They're not focused on their constituents. That's bad. That's bad for our politics. So we need to get away from rewarding that sort of politics and back to people who actually are sent to Washington to do the work that their constituents want. And if they're policymakers or they're in any of the agencies, to see those policies through in a responsible way. That's what most of us are normies, for lack of a better term. And our social media platforms don't really reflect that.
Yeah, and I've had this kind of debate with myself about where does the responsibility lie? Is it on the person pushing these horrible or sensationalized ideas? Or is it on the responsibility of the person that keeps giving them clicks and likes and entertaining into the idea and keeps me,
It's both.
and it's both. It's both. I do think sometimes it is more for one than the other. I certainly think for people that have a very large platform that reaches millions of people, that put a little more responsibility on that person. But still,
Yes.
I think it is both, right? And that gives that person, the individual that chooses to listen, more control and autonomy. It's like you don't have to listen. You don't have to keep entertaining this and giving this power. You realize if you don't do that, it won't have any more power. But it is difficult. So my last question for you is, how do we, as we, it's 2025. We've made it a quarter of the way through the 21st century, which is crazy to think about it that way. But as we continue throughout the 21st century, how do you feel we can maintain a human experience that is human, that stays human? That's not to say that, we don't have any progress or that we just keep it the way it used to be. But, maybe some of those things are slower. But even with new things, even with new technology, even as we have more of a digital or a virtual, okay, fine, that will happen and that's okay. But how do we, as new technologies happen, how these things continue to move, how do we keep things very human-centered and human-focused so we don't miss that or we don't lose that?
This is the question of the future. How do we defend the human? And I do say defend purposefully because we now have to choose the human thing over the mediated or technological thing throughout our daily lives in ways large and small. So I think one thing to do is to ask some important questions before, whether you're an institution or you're just an individual or a small community. You have to ask questions before you embrace that technological thing. So, if you're a therapist, is it better to encourage in-person interactions with your patients as much as possible? Or do you succumb to this is already happening, the pressure from insurance companies to just give somebody a chat bot, a WOBot, a therapy AI-enabled chat bot, because that's cheaper, it's more convenient. Oh, and supposedly more people can be helped. That's where I think the experts need to weigh in and say, no, actually, people are, it is something we do when we care for other people, that we do it as people. We don't outsource those things to technology. We don't outsource the care of our most vulnerable populations, the young, the elderly, the sick and infirm, to technology, because we owe as human beings those obligations to care for each other, particularly in our vulnerable moments. And if you're if you're a parent, if you're an educator, if you're someone who's running a business, before you eagerly adopt the new thing that's being sold that'll make your workforce, your family, your life more efficient, more convenient, more seamless, ask, what will it take away as well as what will it bring? And I'm going to sound goofy, but I put this in the conclusion of the book. I mean, we could be a little more Amish in that the Amish, they use some technology, but the ones they choose, they have really chosen. They have thought through all the ways in which their particular community's needs are met or undermined by whatever they bring into their homes in particular. It's why they do not have television in their home. And phones are often outside of the private home, because they understand that to maintain their norms and to maintain their culture, those things, while useful, would undermine important values. So in a way, the ease and the convenience of all these technologies and their wide availability kind of forces us into this retro role where we have to talk about, what do we value? What are our virtues? What habits are we trying to cultivate in our children and in our communities? We have to go back to asking those questions, because if we don't, it's just too easy to fall into what the technologists want us to do, to make it convenient, to mediate things. And by the time we realize what we've lost, it'll be too late. And so that's where, like, goofy things, even like handwriting, turns out it's really useful for the cultivation of memory and literacy and all these things that we're now discovering. So schools are trying to go back and reintroduce it, which is great. There are a million little things like that. So go throughout your day and think through, when am I choosing to pick up the phone and do this, or a screen and mediate it, rather than just being in the presence of another human being? And ask yourself, which is the qualitatively better experience?
Yeah, I mean, those are great words of wisdom for myself, for all of us, as we continue to try and figure it out. And I hope people are a bit more purposeful and directive in how they want to try and decide the relationship of sorts of how they have with these technologies, and because they'll keep getting faster and more specified, and we have to have kind of for ourselves a kind of way in which we approach it and come at it. So, Christine, this is such a wonderful conversation. I greatly enjoyed it. Your time and wisdom, and we have. As of this conversation, we have no disagreement, so that's always a nice thing, right? So I don't go looking for it.
Next time I'll pick a fight with you, I promise.
Yes, I look forward to that. Okay, well, big thanks for coming on. It's a great pleasure.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.